All right, everybody, I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual interview. My name is Will Boland. I'm a history and government instructor at Northeast Mississippi Community College. Today's virtual interview is going to focus on emergency preparedness, more specifically hurricane emergency or hurricane preparedness. With us today for the next several minutes, we have Miss Ashley Landry. She is a representative of Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. And at this time, Miss Landry, I'll turn it over to you to provide brief information as far as your background and the college in general.
Thank you, Will. So my name is Ashley Landry, and I am the coordinator of administration and safety management here at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. My role helps to service college-wide initiatives and safety. The college has 10 locations and centers across a 4-county district. So that's around 1,000 employees and can range from about 8,000 to 9,000 students. And so it can be a little difficult, and there has to be enough processes and stuff in place so that we can make sure that everybody is safe on all these campuses, especially since they're all unique, especially some of them are coastal counties, so they may be more susceptible to floods, where we have more tornado type hazards in the Stone County, George County area. So each campus and center kind of has their own unique hazards and emergencies that can take place on those campuses. So I help to initiate all those, make sure that we have the right processes in place so we can respond appropriately.
Okay, and so like I said before we started recording, I think for a lot of people that would be watching this, whether they're a 2-year community college, 2-year college, or 4-year institution, at least in my view, what is unique about your institution is the number of campuses, and logically or basically because of its location, you're more susceptible than more, middle America, Northeast institutions as far as susceptibility to these hurricane type disasters. So to get into this more specifically, from the perspective of Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, what goes into the preparation stages before hurricane season, or just preparing for the what if scenarios? What goes on institutional wide or institutionally in terms of preparation and being the most prepared that you can be?
The institution has done a great job at trying to prep for any emergencies that can happen, and a few different things that take place prior to any kind of action that we take before a storm is we have an emergency management policy, which is really great. So that policy is approved by the Board of Trustees, and that pretty much details our emergency action plan. It is recommended that all colleges have one of those because it helps to provide the tools and components necessary to respond to any kind of emergency. So hurricanes are within the emergency action plan, and there's identified personnel in there as well that can help respond to emergencies. Along with that, we also have a hurricane preparedness plan, and this is an excellent tool for how we respond. So if we have anybody new that comes on board and they're not familiar with how we respond to hurricanes, it details everything out with a time period. So it can be 72 to 48 hours before a storm. What is a storm? What communications are going to go out through our mass notification system for employees and students? Who would need to be on campus afterwards? How we're going to communicate. So there's a lot of different components in that plan that really help detail what we're going to do and how we're going to respond. We also have a separate IT preparedness plan too, because it's important that we have our generators on board, that we can make calls. We do have campus police that stay on campus, so we need to make sure that they can call anybody if we need help. So I think that plan and those policies really help us to train individuals accordingly, whether it's just institutional trainings or FEMA, MEMA type training. Without that, it's going to be really difficult for anyone to respond to those type of disasters. So all of those components together really help us before a storm.
While you were speaking through that, one thing that came to mind is, during these crisis prevention scenarios or circumstances or scenarios, if it's a fire, schools, institutions at all levels may conduct annual or regular drills, fire drills, evacuation drills. A thing that's become more common, unfortunately, over the last several years is active shooter scenarios and how that plays out, and trying to get people on the same page and how they react. Does Gulf Coast, Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, do they do anything as far as tabletop exercises, any kind of, quote, real world, exercises specific to hurricanes?
Yes, so we do drills in general. We have drills for communication. We have a really cool conference line that you can call into. So that way, if phone lines and stuff are down, there's still access. You can access it. So everybody has one of these really cool cards, and it's got the numbers and stuff on the back. So we do training for that. We do training on how to respond. We also do training on assessments, because that's huge when you have damages from any kind of a natural disaster. Because if you don't document things appropriately, you may not get insurance funds. You may have no idea how to set up a FEMA claim. So it's really important that you utilize tools such as FEMA and MEMA have a university disaster resistant guidebook and those kinds of things. So I think it's really important when we do our drills, we talk about that. And these drills are conducted with the main individuals on campus who are going to be responding to this. And I think that those drills really help us, because there's going to be a lot of questions that arise whenever these things happen. And the more we do the drills, it's just going to help us in the future. So we do them in conjunction with our monthly drills that are done college-wide on our campuses.
Okay, good. So let's hypothetically scenario, we've got, in the middle of hurricane season, the fall of 2021 semester, we've got Hurricane Alpha, that became a tropical storm, and then it goes into the various categories. It's a category 3 or whatever, and boom, it hits, the Gulf Coast at the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and one or all or some of your campuses are affected. What's the institutional response and plan of action once something actually happens? What goes into consideration in terms of protecting lives, the student body, employees, property, and also working in conjunction with the various first responders that are going to respond to that?
One of the key components with that after a storm is that we have a disaster recovery agreement. And so this is with a local contractor. And so this really helps us if there is a lot of damage, because there's certain protocols and compliance that you have to meet when you're getting debris off of your campus, especially if it's blocking roadways and things of that nature. So this disaster recovery team, through a contractual agreement approved by our board of trustees, helps us with that if we have any damages for buildings and things of that nature. Another thing that is key is taking pictures. There's got to be pictures. We do our drills, we have our contacts. One good thing is we meet before storms with our disaster recovery contact, so we know how to respond appropriately. Now, depending on the severity, obviously it can range for who you have to have on campus. But, like for Hurricane Zeta, we had to make sure, okay, we had our meetings beforehand. We discussed what this could do. Students know that they're not supposed to come to campus. Employees know they're not supposed to come to campus, and that we're going to disseminate information as it becomes available. So you have to communicate that to students and employees before, during, and after the storm, along with making sure that all the people know, okay, you need to have your form for a risk assessment. You got to take your pictures. We have our disaster recovery folks come into campus, and all those together help us. And it's good too, because we have a very large insurance packet, because we have a lot of buildings, obviously with 10 campuses and centers. So being familiar with those policies and having our contact with our insurance company really helps us too. So then we know, okay, if we have X amount of damages, we can file an insurance claim. So it's important to know all of those components, which is a lot. And that's why we had to really start small and move forward from policies to processes, so the way we can respond appropriately.
So some of that brought up a couple of follow-up questions that just kind of came to mind. So there is a difference between the process, and I'm assuming you may do this you may have stated this on an annual basis, as far as going through and documenting with your photos, what the college owns and in what condition it's in, right? So there is an obvious difference in providing that kind of imagery or documentation that way, rather than just trying to push over or show your inventory list, right? That sometimes, depending on the institution, may or not be up to date and accurate and all that. So there is a difference in how you present inventory, equipment, or property that's been damaged or affected by these weather circumstances. You referenced the contractor that you have contractually did the arrangement. Am I wrong to think that from a legal perspective, that reminds me of like having an attorney on retainer, right? Does that mean, can you elaborate on that? Does that mean that if something happens to one or more of the campuses connected with Mississippi Gulf Coast, that the contractor that you got an agreement with, do they just drop everything probably on what they're working on and come to you, or does it depend on the number of employees they have that can come, or how does that happen? And have y'all had to actually, for lack of a better phrase, take advantage of that? Have y'all had to actually use or implement that?
So the agreement that we have, it has to go through the appropriate purchasing guidelines with the state. And pretty much the agreement is enacted just whenever we need it. So those pre-meetings we have before a storm, it says, okay, if this is really, really bad, we're going to need you to come to campus. And essentially, in that agreement, it says that they have the labor, the equipment, the materials, bulldozer, and all those kinds of things to help us. So that was key in selecting a contractor, because we got to make sure that if we have 4 of our campuses that are damaged, that we don't have a contractor too small and they can't service all of it. So that was key in selecting who the contractor is, what their capabilities are. And, with our agreements, if we feel that, maybe if we need to add things or stuff, we can do addendums and follow all those guidelines. But that's kind of how we selected our vendor. I'm not sure. We got the vendor after Hurricane Katrina, because I think Hurricane Katrina was a real pivotal moment for places on the coast to say, okay, Mayday, we really need to have something in place. So we have met with Yates, especially after Hurricane Zeta, because I think Hurricane Zeta was an eye-opener for a lot of schools on the coast as well, whether that's K through 12 or higher education, where maybe we should have enacted them sooner. But we do know moving forward, that's why we have these agreements, is to make sure that we are calling upon them. Sometimes when we think something is damaged, it can be a lot worse than we think it is. So we need to make sure that we are calling upon them. But since I've been in the role, which has only been a little over 2 years, we haven't really called upon them for many things, but we have had meetings to discuss what we're going to do if this thing turns into a Cat 4 or a Cat 5, and how we're going to mitigate those damages.
So refresh my memory. I don't quite remember the details as far as Zeta. When was that?
So Zeta was in October of last year. It affected all of our campuses, or our primary camp, well, really all campuses. And so it was kind of bizarre, because it came towards the end of hurricane season. So it was about October 26th through 28th. We had a lot of significant damages. I believe that it ended up being recorded as a Cat 3. After the fact, it was a Cat 2 in the beginning. And so that was one of the big storms that we had. A lot of times what we have are just tropical storms, warnings, those kinds of things, depressions. So a lot of it's picking up outside materials, making sure cars are put away, those kinds of things. But Hurricane Zeta was one that actually impacted all of our campuses, a lot of it being debris removal, roof leaks, things of that nature.
Okay. Previously, earlier, you had mentioned the mass communication system that you have in place. Can you elaborate on that? Is that primarily email plus text message? Is that something that is mandatory or automatically created once a student enrolls? Is that something that they can opt out? How does that work? And also, you may have said this to begin. What's all campuses? What's the student enrollment?
Student enrollment at all campuses, it varies between about 8,500 and 9,000 students. So we have a lot of students, and those are, academics, CTE, continuing education, adult education. And so we use a mass notification system. So essentially what happens is when a student enrolls and their account is created through our software, then they are instantly enrolled in emergency notifications. You cannot opt out of emergency notifications. This platform is used college-wide for all different areas. But when it comes to emergencies, what happens is every night our software loads into the mass notification software. So you have two different softwares talking to each other. So that way, Will, if your phone number changed this afternoon and you changed it in the system, it's going to automatically update tonight. So that data is fed nightly, which is great. So the way if someone changes their email address, phone number, whatever, we can contact them. We also get reports that say, hey, this person's phone number is invalid. Please contact the student, which is great. So whenever we have these storms, what we do is we email, call, and text employees and students to give them their updated information. Along with the mass notification, we also use our social media outlets. So that way we can get that notification out because folks like to check social media. So we use that, but our mass notification system is critical, and that's why you can't opt out of it, and that's why you're automatically preloaded, which is a great feature, and it really helps us to disseminate information quickly, which is what people need to know.
Now, is that something that parents or legal guardians can also sign up for too?
It's for only active students. For those in our softwares, they'll get it. Now, if they have multiple phone numbers on their account, it would contact all of them. It's set to contact the main, the secondary, both, which is great. So, if my phone got discontinued, my fiance could get the call, which is pretty cool.
Okay, so maybe the workaround, if parents did want to be in the loop or included on that, they would just add their phone number under the student profile or their student information. Okay, well that's good information. Can you talk about as far as we talked about Gates or the construction company. What about after the storm, Hurricane Alpha or Zeta or the next Zeta comes through and it's a category 2 or a 4 or whatever, anywhere in between? How can you talk about the coordination that takes place between your institutional leaders, yourself, others, and the various first responders in terms of, whether any kind of rescue attempts are needed, search for missing, unaccounted for employees or students or other personnel, but then also into the cleanup, if cleanup is necessary as well. How do you coordinate yourselves amongst all these various levels, state, local, federal, if it comes to that, and all these different various agencies, departments, and all of that combined together?
One thing that's important to know is that when there is a hurricane, we're not going to have anybody on campus. The only people that are going to be on campus is campus police. So we don't have to worry about necessarily finding individuals since they're not going to be here. So that's a little different than if there's like a tornado or a fire where we'd have to actually account for all those people. They would have notifications not to come to campus, which is good. So our residence hall students won't be here. Our cafeteria folks who service dining won't be here. So that's a good component. One thing that's important is having someone designated that's going to help to coordinate efforts. And that's one good thing about my position is I can help because it's so difficult when you have so many campuses and centers to compile the right information, especially as it relates to compliance standards. So one thing that we do in order to help with that is we have a template. We have a template Excel spreadsheet, and it talks about here's the campus, here's the address, here's the building that's affected, and here are pictures with a description of the damage. And so that can be used for both insurance or like FEMA MEMA claims. So when we're talking about like FEMA MEMA claims, let's say that your insurance doesn't give you any money. They're like, okay, you don't meet the deductible, and you think, man, how am I going to come up with the funds to help my buildings and infrastructure that were damaged? If you have a hazard mitigation plan in effect, then you can apply for public assistance grants through FEMA when there's not a declared national emergency. So for instance, for Hurricane Zeta, it wasn't declared an emergency until December of last year, and the storm was in October. So once it was declared an emergency, then we could file a FEMA claim to help us, FEMA and MEMA, and they come to campus and they help do your assessments and all that. But if they hadn't have declared that national emergency, it would be really important that you have a hazard mitigation plan so that way if you don't have funding or your insurance is not going to cover it, you can apply for those assistances. Otherwise, you're not going to be eligible for that. So it's really important that before these storms happen, you have hazard mitigation plans, you have a general template. What in the world do people need to compile at the different campuses so that way you can in turn give that to the necessary parties. So I would say that's kind of the most important aspect. Now, depending on the natural disaster, that's when you would have to call in other emergency officials and personnel, utility companies, more law enforcement, things of that nature. But for a hurricane, I think those are the most important aspects that you really have to focus on.
So I know that after Hurricane Katrina in the early mid 2000s, there was an overview, a reevaluation of FEMA response and how they coordinate with state and local personnel, officials, because during Katrina, there was a lot of confusion, miscommunication, sometimes a lack of communication. And so in the aftermath of Katrina, I guess kind of the silver lining to that is that they did reevaluate that, for lack of a better term or word, that hierarchy, that structure of who is in command and who supersedes who and who reports to who and all that stuff combined. But in terms of, FEMA offers various training, online training programs that basically anybody can partake in, can be involved in. You've got the NIMS training certificates or programs that maybe not all are free, but a chunk of them, a large portion of them are. From an institutional perspective, does Mississippi Gulf Coast, whether it's hurricane related or all reactions, all responses, whether it's active shooter, tornado, hurricane, earthquake, fire, whatever, what are the requirements for college personnel to complete any of those training opportunities? Is it just primarily key decision makers, leadership, or do you apply that also to faculty and staff? How does that work?
It's important to note that every person on campus should be familiar with emergency response. That's the whole point, is you don't know when chaos will strike, because it can literally happen at any moment, whether it's somebody, passing out in the office next to me or there's a fire in the residence hall. So that's the kind of approach that we take here at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. So we rely heavily on trainings. That's monthly trainings. So we do emergency action plan trainings, our monthly drills with campus police, and those are really great. We also do FEMA National Incident Management System training, and that gives you an overview of like, hey, here's an emergency, here's how you would respond, and here's what you need to do. It depends on where you're at in the emergency action plan. If you're identified as a key personnel, you're going to have more trainings than everybody else. But the goal of the college is to make sure that everybody has a basic understanding. So that's going to require folks to do some online trainings, attend some sessions live or virtually with me or through our other platforms that we have, so the way they know how to respond. But it really depends on where you fall. Since, I'm a key person after a storm, I'm obviously going to have more trainings than maybe the housekeeper would have. But we make sure that we train everybody, because it really is important, because sometimes the first people to know about a disaster could really be anybody. It could be the guy cutting the grass or the athletic director or VP. So we really take that approach and try to train everyone through multiple platforms.
All right, so far we've talked about, before the storm, in terms of what the institution across all of its campuses and personnel, how they prepare for the what ifs. We've talked about what happens during the storm, clearing the campuses, getting people out in the case of a hurricane. We've talked about what you do after, in terms of organization, working with your contractors, working with other governing agencies, things of that nature. So you said you've been in this current role for about 2 years? Mm-hmm. Was Zeta the bigger hurricane, or was there one that kind of overshadows that one?
That's the biggest one. I like to make a joke that when I first got this role, I knew that chaos can strike at any moment, but I didn't expect there to be a pandemic, Hurricane Zeta, killer bees, and whatever else is yet to come. So I think that I definitely got thrown into it, but in a good way, because sometimes you really don't know the process until you have key individuals who focus on this. So I would actually recommend that all colleges, especially those as large as ours, have people identified for these kinds of things, because I think that the pandemic and Hurricane Zeta and really other storms have really taught us the importance of having that key individual who knows, okay, here's our insurance policies, here's what we got to do, here's how we should prep, that kind of thing. Uh-oh, well, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So last question, in terms of this virtual interview, um, I'm thinking from the faculty perspective, because that's my current role. And so, as a faculty member or a staff member, somebody who's probably not in the chain of command, the hierarchy that's going to be involved in those monthly meetings, but they're also at the same time, if they're not involved in those periodic regular meetings, they're also held basically the same standard in terms of knowing what the institution's response is going to be to all these various circumstances or scenarios. You're expected to know what whether it's Northeast Community College or your institution's response plan is, who the key figures, decision makers are. You may or may not be required to go through certain, FEMA 200, 300, 100, whatever. What can you think of any other resources that faculty and staff could utilize to better familiarize themselves outside of just what the institution provides? Can you think of anything else that would be useful, whether it's hurricanes or anything really?
I really think it's important that people know the different resources that are out there, whether it's websites through NOAA or FEMA or National Hurricane Center, because that's how you're going to get your timely updates. And we try our best to really train these folks in employee development sessions so that way they have a general idea. We also have a lot of signs. I think that's very important is, let's say that you can't make a meeting or you're not sure. There's emergency preparedness signs across the institution. It tells you where you evacuate to, who you call, and what do you do in the event of an active shooter or whatever the scenario may be. So when you utilize all those tools and then you let people know about the resources that they can check, it really helps. So for our hurricane flyers that we have, it tells you, hey, here's how you're going to get information from, here's how you're going to get information from the college, but here's also what you can check when you're at home. And it tells you kind of the things that you should do in your personal life. Because just because we're worried about institutional safety on campus, we're also worried about your safety at home. So it tells you, hey, make sure you have water, make sure you have your evacuation plan at home. And I think that all those resources together are really what helps us to have a successful plan and how we respond to hurricanes.
All right, well, that's about half an hour, so that's a lot of material. But I'm thinking from the perspective, like I said at the lead into this at the beginning, for a lot of people that's going to be watching this through the NASPA website that aren't on the coast and aren't as susceptible to these category whatever hurricanes. It provides a different perspective for a lot of them in terms of hurricane response, and it's not always. A lot of times we instinctively, because of the world we live in and what is covered on the news in terms of emergency response on the college campus, a lot of us just automatically think of the active shooter. And there's legitimacy for that concern, but then there's the other stuff involved too. And I think this adds another layer in terms of what people, in the South, on the coast, whatever, have to keep in mind and prepare and train for. So, Ms. Landry, we thank you for your time. And in closing, I just want to recognize the KC, the knowledge community, for hosting this interview with Ms. Landry. That's the Campus Safety and Violence Prevention group. And we thank you to any of you that are watching. Thanks.